Bruce Thompson, BT Pilates, Invercargill, New Zealand. Pelvic floor for runners. We're going to cover 5 aspects of pelvic floor, and by the end of this time you'll know how to maintain your pelvic floor and use it wisely for running and many other activities. So what are the functions of the pelvic floor? We could list them in 3 ways. The first is to pull the bones of the pelvis together, thus making it very strong to transmit forces from each leg and into the body and vice versa. It looks something like this. So here we have the pelvis. The pelvic floor pulls the bones together. They're now very strong, such that we can see that this is a really strong structure. What happens if the pelvic floor is not pulling the bones together? Well, guess what? We've got all sorts of problems. So that's number 1, strong pelvis. Number 2 is support of the abdominal and intrapelvic organs, such that pelvic organs will not push through into the perineum and out below, which does happen if the pelvic floor is not functioning right. Number 3, the pelvic floor helps to maintain an intra-abdominal pressure. Intra-abdominal pressure is a whole topic in itself and really important for runners. There's a right intra-abdominal pressure for every situation. If we're lying down, the intra-abdominal pressure is about 3 millimeters of mercury. If we're upright, seated in a chair, the intra-abdominal pressure is about 17 millimeters of mercury. When we stand up, the pressure goes up to 20 millimeters of mercury. And if we stand on one leg, the pressure goes up to about 25 millimeters of mercury. If we're walking, it fluctuates because we're continually moving from one leg to the other, such that the pressure when a leg lifts is about 35 millimeters of mercury. When we put it down, it's about 25. For running, the range of intra-abdominal pressure is even more. It's a little bit more dynamic. We push off, the pressure goes to about 60 millimeters of mercury. Put the foot down, it goes down to about 20 millimeters of mercury. And for jumping, the intra-abdominal pressure can go even as high as 150 millimeters of mercury. And for a cough or a sneeze, it might be about 100 millimeters of mercury. So there's a right intra-abdominal pressure for every situation. Now, modern day living reduces the function of the pelvic floor. If we go back to hunter-gatherer days, we could imagine that we were on our feet most of the day, walking, standing, squatting, and when it came to night time, there wouldn't be electric lights, and we'd be lying down for a long period of time with the intra-abdominal pressure low, and the pelvic floor could take a really good long rest. But nowadays, instead of walking, squatting, standing, we're seated in a chair most of the time. The intra-abdominal pressure is still working away. The pelvic floor is not able to change the intra-abdominal pressure, and there's no movement in the legs, so there's really no increase of blood flow to the pelvic floor. Also, with electric lights, we're seated more, we're lying down less, and so there's less time for the intra-abdominal pressure to reduce to 0 and the pelvic floor to take a full and relaxing break. Anatomy and cueing for the pelvic floor. There's a few things we need to know. The first is that the pelvic floor is like a muscular bowl that sits deep inside the pelvis with the rim of the bowl attached to about the middle of the pelvis. Now, under the muscular bowl of the pelvic floor is the perineum, and that's the area of skin between the sit bones and the pubic bone and tailbone, front and back. Now, in that area of the perineum, we've got the back passage and we've got the male and female organs. The perineum is something we can contact with and get a feel for. It's harder to get a feel for the actual pelvic floor, although not impossible. So we'd just like to set up a visual of the pelvis and the pelvic floor. Imagine these are the sit bones, seated on a chair. At the front, we've got the pubic bone. It's a little bit above the chair seat, and the tailbone also just a little bit above the chair seat. And in between, we have the perineum. Now, as movement instructors, we have some very useful cues for how to get this pelvic floor working. Here they are. The first is we think about pulling the sit bones together. And the second is we think about lifting the perineum like pinching and lifting a silk handkerchief up and in. Other cues might be a squeeze and lift of the back passage or rectum, and the same sort of a squeeze and lift of the male or female sexual parts. We can also talk about the very lowest part of the abdomen, that 1 inch of abdominal muscle that is just above the front rim of the pelvis. When the pelvic floor is squeezing and lifting, we've got that feel of pinch and lift in the perineum, we also have that 1 inch of lower abdominal muscles also firming up, and we can feel for these things. So let's see if we can make these pelvic floor cues work for us. Well, we can do it just sitting in a chair. We sit on the chair, palms up, fingers touching, just place the fingers under the sit bones. And I've got my sit bones pressing into my fingers, and the tips of fingers touching. So we just think of perineum, the silk hanky being pulled up inside, sit bones coming together, and we might just feel the perineum lifting off our pads of our fingers. Not sure about that? We'll just relax everything down below, and yes, the perineum sunk down upon the fingers. And so once we've got that feel of a squeeze, pinch, lift, firming up, did the lower tummy firm up as well? The very lowest 1 inch down here. Think of the silk hanky pulled up, the sit bones together, did it firm up here as well? Well, yes, it did. And the rest of the tummy stayed reasonably relaxed. So that's the pelvic floor cues. And we can take this into running or walking. And so we've just got that feel of a little squeeze, pinch and lift. And the lower tummy's just firmed up a bit. The upper tummy's still reasonably relaxed. And away we go. We've got a little pelvic floor lift. And as a result of that pelvic floor lift down below, the intra-abdominal pressure just goes up just that little bit so that it pumps us up like a truck tire. So if the pelvic floor drops down, just let go of the handkerchief, and we get the pelvic floor going, and then the rest of the abdomen, a little squeeze, pinch and lift, like blowing up a truck tire, up we go, tall and relaxed, ready for running. Maintenance of the pelvic floor. I've already said how modern living destroys the proper functioning of the pelvic floor, so we do need to spend some time on maintaining our pelvic floors. Not just the women, it's more of a problem for women, but it's also a problem for men, especially if we want to optimize our athletic activities. The pelvic floor is a muscle, and we maintain it in the same ways we maintain other muscles. We rest our muscles, we stretch and mobilize our muscles, and we strengthen our muscles. So we begin with the resting. We just make sure we actually do get to lie down for a significant amount of the night. So don't sit, lie down. There we go. We're now resting our pelvic floor. And that happens when we lie down. The intra-abdominal pressure is now about 3 millimeters of mercury, and we can just think about relaxing all the way from the neck right down the body to the perineum. To get the stretching and mobilizing working, we use the breath. Now, for the purpose of stretching and mobilizing the pelvic floor, we think of the breath expanding, as it were, into the whole body. The breath only goes into the lungs, obviously, and the lungs only come to about halfway down the chest. But as we breathe in, we expand the body part. Imagine that we can breathe into a pear-shaped area of the body, all the way from the perineum, right up to about halfway up the chest, and the pear's wider at the bottom. So we want to breathe into the lower part, as though breathing into a balloon. We breathe as though into a balloon into the perineum, and also the very lowest tummy. So breathing in, here, and relax the neck. Keep the throat open. This is not a Valsalva. Keep the throat open. Breathing in, ballooning out between the sit bones. And keep long and relaxed in the neck, and just and breathing in again. As we breathe in, we balloon the pelvic floor down, the very lowest tummy. We're expanding an area of the body that looks pear-shaped. And relax the neck and grow tall. And that's how we stretch and mobilize our pelvic floors. And then we can just relax and rest. Now, for exercising our pelvic floor, we put the body in a bracing position. We could use a sawhorse position, so that we know the tummy's working. Yes, it's firming up. The intra-abdominal pressure has now come up. If we get this pelvic floor moving now, it's got some load on it, and we're doing strength work. Now we breathe in against the lifted pelvic floor. I want you to imagine this time that we're breathing into a cylinder in the body that runs all the way from the perineum right up to about halfway up the chest. And we breathe equally into the lower cylinder as the upper cylinder. The pelvic floor, squeeze, pinch and lift. Pull the sink hanky up inside. And there we go. Now breathing into the cylinder of the body. Relax the neck. We're not breathing into the collarbone area. Relax the neck and grow longer. Pelvic floor is pulling up. And then relax the neck, grow long, and breathe out. Maintaining a little pelvic floor lift. And again, breathing into the cylinder of the body, right up to about the nipple line of the chest. Relax the neck, keep the throat open. And breathing out, keep the pelvic floor going. The cylinder of the body gets narrower. This is working the diaphragm as well. So that's pelvic floor for runners. Enjoy.